Imagine for a second a world where your spouse, your kids, your parents, where they aren't your safety net.
Right, where they're not the ones you turn to.
Exactly. They aren't your support system in this cold, chaotic universe.
Mm.
But instead, they are actually the primary, undeniable cause of your deepest mental suffering.
Like the very people you lean on are actually the bars of your cage.
Yeah, it's wild. And today, we're taking a deep dive into an essay that makes exactly that claim. I mean, it just totally flips every single thing we are taught about human connection and sociology completely on its head.
It really does. It completely upends our fundamental understanding of, well, emotional survival. Because we're all socially conditioned to believe that intimacy is the antidote to pain, right?
Right, of course.
But the philosophy we're exploring today argues that intimacy is the very engine of our anxiety.
Because usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision. Like if you break your arm, an x-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it, puts a cast on it, and you heal.
Sure, it's a very clear cause and effect.
But when you step into the world of human suffering, the landscape of anxiety, depression, and existential dread, that x-ray machine is utterly useless. The diagnostic landscape is just incredibly murky.
Extremely murky. I mean, in the modern world, we look for the root causes of our pain in our brain chemistry or our childhood trauma.
Or like our work-life balance.
Exactly. We try to fix it by tweaking the individual. We treat the person because we assume the surrounding structure of society is just a permanent fixture.
It's like the weather.
Yes. We assume the family unit, the nation state, the economic market, they're just the weather. And if you are getting wet, well, it's your responsibility to buy an umbrella.
Right. But the text we are examining today refuses to accept the weather. It argues that the individual isn't broken at all. It's actually the entire architecture of human society that is engineered to cause misery.
Which is a huge claim to make.
Yeah, it's massive. So the source text for this exploration is a profoundly radical essay. It's titled How to Break Free from Suffering, and it was written by Xufeng in January of 2022.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack the architecture of this argument.
Right. We are going to look at his highly unconventional definitions of pain, his deeply controversial diagnosis of society's ills, and the extreme, sweeping blueprint he offers for a totally utopian future.
And just to be super clear up front, we aren't here to take sides. We're not endorsing this worldview.
Oh, absolutely not. We are here purely as philosophical mechanics, just dissecting how this author builds his argument from the ground up.
Because engaging with a philosophy that challenges every norm you hold dear is honestly one of the best ways to understand your own beliefs.
For sure.
But mapping his thought process requires us to kind of suspend our defensive reflexes. The ideas presented here, they escalate rapidly from personal internal psychology to massive global societal restructuring.
Yeah, so to understand the radical cure he proposes, which, spoiler, involves dismantling borders and eradicating marriage, we have to start at the absolute foundation of his logic. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right, let's start with how Xufeng actually categorizes human suffering.
Because he doesn't just lump every bad feeling into one vague cloud of sadness. He defines suffering specifically as feelings like discomfort, depression, anxiety, fear, disappointment, and hopelessness.
And then he separates all of that into three distinct tiers. You've got physical, spiritual, and mental.
And the distinctions between these three tiers are crucial, right?
Yeah.
Because they dictate the difficulty of the cure.
Exactly. Physical suffering is straightforward. It is biological, it's tangible, and according to the text, it is something that can be endured and physically healed.
Like if you cut your hand, it hurts, but the body has a mechanism to close the wound. If physical pain is like a broken bone that can heal, then there is the second tier, which is spiritual suffering.
Right. And the text claims this type of suffering is eliminated simply by establishing faith in the greatest creator.
Which, sounds a bit abstract on the surface.
It does, but if you look at the mechanics of what he's saying, it makes a lot of sense within his framework. Spiritual suffering is that paralyzing existential dread, that feeling of being a meaningless speck in a random, chaotic universe.
So it's like wandering without a compass.
Perfect analogy. By establishing an absolute faith in a greatest creator, you are essentially outsourcing that terrifying burden of universal meaning to a higher power.
Oh, wow, yeah. Once you hand over the responsibility of cosmic purpose, the spiritual angst is instantly neutralized.
Right. It is a mechanical transfer of existential weight. So 2 out of his 3 categories, physical and spiritual, have relatively straightforward functional solutions.
You heal the body, And you outsource the existential dread.
Exactly. But that brings us to the third bucket, which is really the pivot point of his entire philosophy, and that's mental suffering.
Yeah, and Suhang argues that mental suffering is by far the most difficult to overcome. In this framework, mental suffering is like being locked in a cage.
A cage you might not even realize you're in.
Right. And his diagnosis for why it happens is where this text breaks entirely from modern psychology. He treats mental suffering less like a complex, nuanced disease and more like a rigid mathematical algorithm.
Which is such a fascinating way to look at it.
Right. In his formula, mental suffering stems entirely from one single source, which is a lack of freedom.
Whether it is physical freedom, mental, financial, or freedom of action.
Yeah, any form of restriction is the direct, undeniable input that creates the output of mental anguish.
What's fascinating here is how directly and unapologetically he equates mental well-being with absolute, unadulterated freedom. I mean, traditional therapy might tell you that your anxiety comes from cognitive distortions.
Or like a chemical imbalance or unresolved grief.
Right, but Zwifeng rejects all of that complexity. He states that the inability to experience total freedom is the core root, period.
So if you input a social obligation, even a really well-intentioned one, you restrict freedom.
Exactly, and when freedom is restricted, the human mind suffers.
Which means if you want to cure the anxiety and the depression, you have to find the restriction. You have to literally locate the bars of the cage holding you in.
And he doesn't just say, look for restrictions. The text outlines a highly specific, rule-based method for finding them, based on a concept of proximity.
Yeah, he essentially draws a map of human pain. He argues that you must dig up the roots of suffering by looking at your immediate surroundings first, and then kind of expanding outward.
The rule of proximity dictates that the closer something or someone is to you, the more likely they are to cause acute, severe mental suffering.
Right.
And then the farther away the entity is from your daily life, the easier the pain is to bear.
Which is an inverse relationship to how we normally view threat levels.
Yeah.
You know? This is where I find the text incredibly jarring. It directly assaults the whole concept of a support system.
It really does.
Because when we think of the people closest to us, we think of them as our shield against a harsh world. But Zhofeng explicitly lists these exact people as the near sources of your suffering.
The near sources, yeah. He names spouses, parents, children, siblings, relatives, friends, colleagues.
He even throws in teachers, masters, partners, and fellow spiritual practitioners.
Nobody is safe from the list.
Literally nobody. And I have to push back a little here because it feels incredibly counterintuitive, you know? To read that your own child or your best friend is the primary cause of your mental anguish, it's tough to swallow.
Oh, it's definitely a hard pill. But it forces us to take a really hard look at the sociology of why we form families in the first place and what the hidden costs of those structures actually are.
Right, because historically humans form family units for survival, right? For resource sharing, emotional security.
Sure. But in Schweffing's algorithmic logic, intimacy inherently breeds obligation.
Obligation.
Yes. When you are in a close relationship, a marriage, a parent-child dynamic, or even just a deep friendship, there are constant daily expectations. There are compromises.
Because you can't simply wake up and do whatever you want, whenever you want, without considering the impact on the other person.
Exactly. Think about the sheer volume of micro-compromises you make in a single day when you share a house with a spouse or raise a child. That constitutes a massive forfeiture of your personal autonomy.
Right. You are restricting your physical movement just to be home for dinner. You're restricting your financial freedom to pay for their needs.
And Schweffing gives very explicit examples of this. He says restrictions on physical freedom mainly come from marital relationships, while financial restrictions come from relatives and market monopolies.
And the thing is, in this framework, those obligations are not viewed as beautiful bonds of love or like meaningful sacrifices. They're viewed purely as mechanical restrictions of your absolute freedom.
Yeah. The family dinner table is essentially ground zero for human misery, simply because sitting at that table means you are not totally free to be somewhere else.
That is so intense. And that dynamic becomes even starker when you compare it to the far sources of suffering he identifies.
Yeah.
Because moving outward from the family, he lists larger, more distant entities that restrict us.
Right. He mentions thieves and bullies, but scales all the way up to gangs, tribes, extremist groups, nations, governments, political parties, and religions.
Yeah, he argues that the machinery of the state causes a physical restriction of movement, Like, think of borders and passports.
And political parties and religions cause a restriction of mental freedom by dictating ideology.
But crucially, right, under his rule of proximity, the pain inflicted by these massive entities is considered easier to bear than the pain inflicted by your own family.
Which again sounds crazy until you follow his logic, because the state is a distant jailer while your spouse is a jailer in your own living room?
Right. The government might take 30% of your paycheck in taxes, or tell you that you can't cross a certain border without a visa. But the government isn't sleeping in the same bed as you.
They aren't demanding your daily emotional energy.
Exactly. They aren't dictating your weekend plans or criticizing your habits. The proximity of the family means the restrictions are constant, intimate, and just suffocating.
And the logic holds together perfectly within the boundaries he sets. If restriction equals suffering, then the entity that restricts your daily life the most frequently and intimately is, by default, the greatest source of your pain.
So, if the sources of our suffering are woven into the very fabric of our personal relationships and our global institutions, like, what do we do? If intimacy is the cage, how do we get out?
Well, traditional psychology would say you go to couples counseling, right? You set boundaries, or you practice mindfulness.
Sure, you go to therapy.
But Shifeng's logic demands a completely different approach. He views our normal, everyday coping mechanisms as entirely useless.
He dismisses them outright, doesn't he?
Oh, completely. Because they're fundamentally designed to treat the individual while leaving the toxic structure entirely intact.
Right. He writes that moral education and the preaching of sages have almost no effect. He calls religious doctrines a mere temporary anesthetic.
Like you take the spiritual pill, you feel numb to the pain for a few hours, but the disease of restriction is still ravaging your life.
He even mocks the modern self-help industry. He refers to spiritual practices and inspirational chicken soup for the soul as just scratching the surface.
Because using traditional therapy in this scenario is like constantly upgrading the shock absorbers on a car that you are intentionally driving off a cliff.
Yes. You can reframe your thoughts, you can meditate, you can read all the inspirational quotes you want, but the problem isn't the suspension of the car. The problem is that the road you are driving on is a cliff.
The structure of society itself is the cliff.
Exactly. You just can't meditate your way out of a fundamentally broken societal structure. Like trying to put a small adhesive bandage on a house that has a cracked, sinking foundation.
This raises an important question, though. If the road is the problem, where exactly does he expect humanity to drive?
Right.
If every existing structure from the intimate family unit all the way up to the nation state is a trap, what does the replacement look like?
Well, Schwefing concludes that personal therapy is a dead end, and the only genuine solution is the total rebuilding of what he calls the order of human production and life.
The order of human production and life. Okay.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting, because he doesn't just offer a vague philosophical critique. He provides a highly specific, radical six-step manifesto for completely eliminating human suffering.
By basically dismantling human society down to the studs.
Exactly. And he starts with the most intimate restriction. Step 1, demanding we eliminate marriage and dissolve all families.
Dissolving the family is just a breathtakingly extreme proposition.
It's a huge pill to swallow. I mean, eliminating marriage and families entirely is an incredibly extreme way to solve the feeling of restriction.
It is. It asks the individual to trade all personal, intimate bonds and the deep sense of belonging that comes with them for absolute untethered freedom.
Right. It suggests that the only way to avoid the pain of a broken heart, or like the immense stress of providing for a dependent, is to simply eradicate the formalized family structure entirely.
And if you think dissolving the family is a massive escalation, he scales this logic right up to the global level in the next step.
Oh, yeah, he does.
Because if localized loyalty causes restriction, you must dismantle all local loyalties. So he demands we open all borders to allow totally free human migration.
No more nations.
No more nations. And if there are no nations, political parties are entirely useless. So his next step is removing political parties from any government management.
Which is step 2 and 4 combined there. And he applies the same neutralizing logic to ideology, right?
Exactly. Since he previously identified organized religion as a restrictor of mental freedom, he mandates banning religion from participating in any government affairs.
So he is methodically erasing every single institutional boundary that divides humanity or binds an individual to a specific localized identity.
Right. No family to restrict your time, no nation to restrict your movement, no political or religious party to restrict your mind.
Which just leaves humanity with a complete blank slate.
A total reset.
Yeah. And to fill that massive vacuum, his final steps are to promote the production and life mode of something called the second home of Lifechanyuan,
Oh.
and ultimately transition all global citizens into this new era.
To understand how this second home functions without collapsing into chaos, we really have to look at the economic and social mechanics he is implying here.
Because it sounds wild.
It does. When he talks about a new production and life mode, he is talking about replacing the nuclear family economy with a communal structure.
Oh.
In our current system, you work a job, often one you dislike, to hoard resources specifically to feed and shelter your own spouse and your own children.
Which is the financial restriction he mentioned earlier.
Right. But in the second home model, labor and resources are totally decoupled from the nuclear family.
Because if you don't have a specific spouse or child to hoard resources for, production becomes entirely communal. The community works to sustain everyone collectively.
Exactly. It effectively eliminates the financial anxiety and the market monopolies that force people into restrictive, painful lives.
Because nobody owns anything privately.
And if nobody owns anything privately, nobody is burdened by the restriction of maintaining that private ownership.
It is a total systemic reset, the replacement of restricted local loyalties with a singular, borderless, shared global identity.
Synthesizing those 6 points, yeah, that is exactly what it is.
So what does this all mean for the lived experience of a human being? Like, if humanity were to actually execute this radical societal reset, what does Weifeng promise is waiting for us on the other side of this massive demolition?
Right, because tearing down borders and families sounds terrifying to most people.
Obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But he promises a highly specific, flawlessly engineered utopia. He claims to have prepared the exact path from theory to practice to ensure the happiness of all humanity.
And he is very clear about what this future society will not be. He explicitly rejects the American model, which he calls a legalistic form.
Meaning relying on endless laws and lawsuits to manage behavior.
Right. And he also rejects the Chinese model, which he characterizes as rule by man, relying on the authority of specific leaders.
Instead, he says the future will be a holographic way guided by saints and managed by sages.
A holographic way.
Yeah, which is such a fascinating mechanical concept. If you think about how a physical hologram works,
Right.
every single shattered shard of the glass contains the complete, identical image of the whole.
Exactly. And when applied to sociology, a holographic society operates like a fractal, or even a biological cell. Every single community unit and every single individual operates on the exact same cultural DNA and blueprint as the entire globe.
Right.
Because the values of absolute freedom and communal harmony are perfectly embedded in everyone, the system doesn't need a heavy-handed central government or a complex legal system to dictate laws.
The society naturally polices and sustains itself through shared embedded harmony.
Yeah.
And I marvel at the contrast here, because the imagery he uses to describe this holographic utopia is incredibly pastoral and idyllic. Compared to the highly destructive means of dissolving all families, the result is so peaceful.
It is. He says the talented are put to good use, ensuring no one's potential is restricted. The world operates as one single family.
He uses these beautiful, highly specific examples, too. He says no one will pocket things found on the ground, and doors will not be bolted at night.
And that specific imagery perfectly illustrates the mechanics of his economic model. You don't need locks on your doors because the concept of theft is entirely obsolete in a society without private ownership or scarcity.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Right. If all resources are fully utilized and communally shared, there is simply no motivation to steal.
He promises that the young will be well educated, and the old will be looked after without the burden falling on a single, stressed-out adult child.
Everyone fulfills their responsibilities naturally.
He even goes so far as to claim this society will enjoy favorable weather and thriving industries. It is a mathematically pristine vision where all the friction of human existence is smoothed out and mental suffering just disappears forever.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see how Weifeng's essay fits into a rich, historical tradition of utopian manifestos.
Oh, absolutely.
For centuries, philosophers have proposed that human nature is fundamentally good, but it is deeply corrupted by the artificial institutions we have built to manage ourselves.
Right, the enduring utopian theory is that if you remove the artificial divisions, like if you erase the borders, empty the bank accounts, dissolve the political factions, and literally burn the marriage licenses, humanity will naturally, effortlessly revert to a state of absolute harmony and abundance.
It sets up the ultimate philosophical cost-benefit analysis.
It really does. The cost of this utopia is tearing apart the fundamental, intimate building blocks of human life as we know and understand it today.
But the promised benefit is a peaceful, unified world, totally free from the crushing weight of anxiety and depression.
Which brings us to the end of our journey through this incredibly provocative text. Just to recap the massive ground we've covered today. We started with a deeply personal, everyday feeling of mental suffering.
Right, that anxiety.
We mapped Feng's logic, identifying our most intimate relationships and our governments as the literal jailers of our freedom.
We discarded traditional self-help and therapy as flawed tools just trying to fix a broken road.
And finally, we explored his radical, uncompromising roadmap, the complete dissolution of family, borders, and politics to usher in the borderless, perfectly harmonious era of Lifechanyuan.
It is a vast, uncompromising, and flawlessly consistent architecture of thought, regardless of how extreme its conclusions may seem.
I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this intense intellectual exploration today. The entire purpose of this deep dive is to expose you to dramatically different ways of viewing human existence, even if they challenge every norm we hold.
Because engaging with a philosophy that challenges the very foundation of how we love and live is the sharpest tool we have for understanding ourselves.
Definitely.
And we leave you today with a final, lingering question to ponder as you go back to your families and your daily routines.
Think about that perfectly engineered holographic world Feng described. A world with absolutely no poverty, no locked doors, thriving industries, flawless harmony, and a society where mental suffering, anxiety, and depression are completely eradicated.
If the absolute ironclad guarantee of that world required you to willingly dissolve your marriage, give up your family unit, and surrender your national identity forever, is that a price you would be willing to pay?